Good evening and good afternoon, folks in the UK and in rest of Europe and Ireland. I saw Stockholm and the entire EU. I'm so happy to see you all here. And also, good morning to a lot of North American folks, and maybe good night also, because I was going to mention to Kate that one of my friends is from Australia, and she said I think they're going to have to start an Australian version soon because it's midnight over there. So she probably will be watching the recording. But anyhow, welcome, folks. My name is Nidhi Sachdeva, and I am a teacher, a professor at the University of Toronto. My research interest is microlearning, and I've written my thesis on it. And if you ever want to read it, if you were looking for reading material on microlearning, it's available on through Google Scholar and through University of Toronto's T-Space. But today, without further ado, what I want to talk to you about is how to design effective microlearning with the science learning. So the one piece that I want to mention is that starting with the notion of why science learning, I think, is important. So why are we actually talking about science learning when we're talking about microlearning? Well, because there's a ton of evidence that comes from it. That's what really helps us gain understanding about what works and what doesn't when it comes to learning or training and enhancing what we call long-term performance, right? And why microlearning? Well, because when you start uncovering theories from the science learning and start to make sense of these theories in practice, be it teaching or training within the learning and development industry, you start to realize that the very nature of microlearning, and I heard terms like bite-sized learning, I've also heard nano learning, nano-sized, snackable learning, all kinds. You understand that the very nature of microlearning aligns really nicely with the evidence-informed instructional practices. And that's why microlearning. It's almost like microlearning lends itself well to apply science learning in practice, right? Now that we've clarified briefly why microlearning and why through the lens of science learning, I want to begin by briefly explaining the information processing model to you. And this is where the challenge will be here, because I had some animations which we can watch because my screen's not being shared right now. But Chris is going to go to the next slide for me. Thank you, Chris. And now you have to picture these green squares moving along. They won't, because this is a PDF that Chris is sharing, and I'm not able to share the screen where there are the animations. But I'll briefly walk you through this. Okay, so just follow along. So let's try to understand microlearning, or learning generally, whatever you want to call it, through the lens of information processing model. Now, many of you are already probably familiar with this model because it's taught in most educational psychology courses and also in like Psych 101 courses. The information processing model, right on top, you can see it begins with a sensory memory. This is where we receive information through our senses, primarily through visual and auditory. So picture these green squares falling in there. And then I normally would have clicked 3 times for you to see the 3 squares going into the orange box, right? Now, before new knowledge, the green squares are your new knowledge. Before your new knowledge can actually be stored in long-term memory, it must first pass through and be processed in working memory, okay? So I picture the green squares in the orange box now, or the reddish color box. Now, here's the interesting part, and really key to understand for us all as instructional designers or anybody who's dealing with any kind of learning. The working memory has a very limited capacity. It's what we're conscious of at any given time, right? That's going to actually enter there. Research suggests that we can only hold 4 to 7 chunks of information in working memory at any one time. So, for example, if I gave you a list of 3 random numbers, you could probably keep them in your working memory, and several minutes later, you could tell me those numbers. But if I give you a list of about 20 random numbers, it would be really hard for you to remember them all, because you can only keep a certain amount of information in your working memory. That's the limit that it comes with, right? But in some cases, you can think of working memory as a bottleneck as well, right? These are the limits to the speeds at which learners or folks who are consuming learning material can take in and process new knowledge, right? Now, if we manage to do that, and those green squares manage to go into that orangey color box, then the final step is that those green boxes or squares are the new knowledge to bring it to long-term memory. This is the deliberate effort. This is where the learner, the consumer of the knowledge, has to do a little bit of extra work, and instruction helps as well to encode the new knowledge in working memory and connect it with things in our long-term memory. So think of the blue squares as what already exists in our brain, right? This is our background knowledge, prior knowledge. And the green squares would really very much like it if the blue squares and green squares could establish connections within itself, right? Which is basically new knowledge always looks for prior knowledge to connect to. And when that happens, that's when good quality learning takes place, right? So this is obviously a very basic information processing model, and I hope you were able to visualize it. In the last step of my animation is, the green squares lead connect to the blue squares, and then the white lines shows that connections are establishing, right? So it's good to know this, and this was a very, very brief sort of overview of it. Chris, we can go to the next slide. All right. So now that you have a basic understanding of the information processing model, and really two important things to know is that there's a working memory which is limited in time and capacity for all new knowledge, and there's a long-term memory where it's nice to have more background knowledge so that new knowledge feels not left out and feels connected and feels more deeply embedded, right? Now, there are five sort of theories and concepts in front of you right now. Information processing model, having that understanding and understanding these theories really help you design effective microlearning, right? So the first one, and I'm going to briefly talk about it because it's a real quick session, and of course at any time if you want to learn more about it, I'm happy to share resources as well. But cognitive load theory is really tapping into that limitation of the working memory that I was just talking about in the information processing model. Cognitive load theory reminds us that our working memory is already limited, but it can get overloaded so quickly. From things like how complex the learning material is, or how distractive the instruction might be, or how many distractions are around the learner in the moment, right? So when you're designing instruction, paying attention to that limitation of the working memory can be very, very important step, right? So cognitive load theory reminds us of two really major sources of overload: intrinsic load and extraneous load. Intrinsic comes from the material itself that is being learned, and extraneous is everything else around it, which can be also from instruction. So too many animations, for example, can also be quite distracting for learners. Do I need this visual? Do I not need this visual? Those kind of things, right? So cognitive load theory can be a good friend of yours when you're designing microlearning that you really want it to be effective, that it lands on the goal that you had originally hoped for. Otherwise, it could be an overwhelming or ineffective experience for the people who are consuming it. The second theory you see is dual coding theory, and then I also have the term cognitive theory of multimedia learning. Lots of theories in here. So again, real brief one-liners here for all of them. Dual coding theory we've known about this since late 1960s. Basically, the idea is that we have two channels to process information, verbal and nonverbal. So verbal can process text, nonverbal can process everything else, like imagery or graphics or sounds, things like that. Dual coding theory tells us that we can process knowledge based on both those channels, right? Which is why when we look at text and a visual along with it, we understand that better. It actually has an additive effect. And dual coding theory, along with cognitive load theory, has given rise, sort of created cognitive theory of multimedia learning, which we popularly know as Mayer's multimedia principles. And Richard Mayer has done a tremendous job with many experimental studies to give us all these principles. One of them you probably heard of is multimedia principle, which says people learn better with words and pictures than words alone or pictures alone, right? And then there's also things like where should you put the label next to a visual. There's also things like contiguity principle, spatial contiguity principle. There's things like redundancy principle. There's so many principles. I really recommend taking a little bit of a deeper dive into it as you design multimedia content, which is aimed at microlearning, right? Because there's a lot of digital work that we're going to be doing with when you're designing microlearning. So that's dual coding and a very, very touch and go of multimedia principles. The next two on your screen are retrieval practice and distributed practice. These are tremendous. So going back to the information processing model, think about the deep long-term memory. Think about the third level of the memory that I was talking about. This is where you can really help the consumer of the knowledge or information to be able to retain it longer. So what is retrieval practice? Retrieval practice in very simple words is to be able to recall knowledge that you've just learned or learned at some point without having it in front of you. So doing simple things like quizzes or a recall or what do you remember from it, or asking someone to do like a quick brain dump of what was taught or shared in a certain training, that's all retrieval. And why does it matter? Because research shows that when we recall something from our memory, we actually end up retaining it much better and stronger, right? So retrieval practice is another really powerful strategy to be able to memorize and enhance the power of our long-term memory. And the deeper it stays in your memory, the better, the faster the recall. So it's kind of like you recall to retain, and it works amazingly in our brains, right? The next one is distributed practice. Distributed practice is also known as spaced practice or space learning. Basically, the idea is rather than doing something in one massive chunk as a block or mass learning, you space it over time. And it's pretty simple idea because we know it works and the evidence is really, really powerful. But what we end up doing, and universities do the same thing, lots of training sessions do the same thing. We do these one long days of training session, we sit through it, we try to go over it, but then 2 days later, 2 weeks later, we've all forgotten about it. But the more impact would be if this was distributed in a more organized way, right? And that's where long-term learning takes place. It makes a lot more sense for the learner and their long-term memory to be able to retain information. Combining distributed practice and retrieval practice is a magical combination. So you could do that really well. And I'll tell you in 1 second why all these theories matter. The last one, probably, again, I have another slide for it, Rosenshine's principles of instruction. These are about 10 principles that have so much evidence, amazing for every parent, every teacher, every instructional designer to remember as you're designing instruction of all kinds, including microlearning, right? Now, why these 5 theories? If you look at them, when you're designing microlearning automatically makes way to, make space for working memory limitations. You could do a lot of dual coding theory and multimedia principles when you're designing microlearning. Retrieval practice and distributed practice, so convenient. Microlearning lends itself really nicely for all these theories, and Rosenshine's principles as well. So I'll ask Chris to go to the next slide, which is where we're going to talk about briefly about Rosenshine's principles. So here are the 10 Rosenshine's principles. And if you look at the language of these principles, I'll give you a second to absorb it. Look how simple this language is. I mean, Barack Rosenshine did a lot of work, so much work for us, and put together these 10 so simply understandable principles that we can apply. And I use that as a parent of kids, as an educator, and also a trainer, also a content designer. This is simple language. Now look at it. Daily review. Again, this applies more in school situations, but it also applies in training. Presenting new material in small steps. Bingo. We were just talking about bite size, right? Rosenshine said it. And he didn't say it for microlearning. He just designed or created these principles based on the evidence he looked at. And he didn't look at just one body of literature. He looked at 3 huge bodies of literature, and then he gave us this. Asking questions, bingo, retrieval practice. Providing models, showing someone how to do something, work examples is very, very important. Guiding learners practice, showing some first and then let them, that notion of I do, we do, you do, and it works really great in training also, depending on what kind of training you're doing. Checking for understanding is very important because it's really dangerous to have false understanding, misconceptions. Background knowledge can be really, really inaccurate and insufficient, and that can be dangerous. Checking if people are learning, having success rate makes you feel motivated. Providing scaffolds for difficult tasks and removing them. Microlearning does that really well. Giving time for independent practice because, I learned the piano, and if I don't practice it, I'm not really going to be able to recall it and do it myself. And definitely having regular review. So it starts with the review, ends with the review. This is not a checklist. These are principles that you use based on what your needs might be, right? Now, if you look at it, microlearning, I have a sentence at the bottom. All these principles, I really feel, and I've been doing a lot of thinking around it lately, is that all these microlearning lends itself so beautifully to apply these principles if you think about it. You could ask questions and it could be quick, micro-learning. You could provide model and example, it could be quick, like a video or a short sort of 7 taps kind of micro lesson, done, right? You could provide practice with it, you could check for understanding. There's so many amazing things you could do, right? So these are the kind of things that I feel micro-learning can provide really, really beneficial sort of uh, as a strategy, as an approach, right? And then which platform you use, which tool you end up doing, that's all up to you. But if you think about multimedia principles, if you think about the working memory limitations, if you think about retrieval practice, because it's important to be able to recall from our memory so that we memorize longer, then you're on the track of making micro-learning more effective. And that's sort of like the idea that I wanted to share with you all today, is that how do you design effective micro-learning based on what the science of learning says? And science of learning offers us a lot of evidence that this works. Take it and now just run with it, basically. I'm not sure how much time I have, but I have probably one more slide. Chris, can you go to it? Oh, a couple more slides. Okay, so I hope I have a few more minutes here. So here's some of the principles that I want to talk about. So when you're designing micro-learning or micro-lessons for someone, you want to think about those principles, but here or those theories. But I have put together, this came out of my doctoral research as well. What are some of the principles that you want to think about? So you want to think about the content, and think about what the learner already knows. And that's what sometimes you don't need a micro learning, but sometimes you do. And think about what the content's going to be. Then think about the instructional purpose. Think about the why. Why are you doing it? Is it a review? Is it an augment? Is it to clarify something? Is it a training? Is it a tricky concept and you want to do that again, right? And then think about the appropriate length and structure. It's not so much about the time as much as it is about mental complexity. So when you're designing microlearning, don't necessarily think I must finish it in 30 seconds, because you can overwhelm somebody's working memory even if it's only 30 seconds, right? Short doesn't always means effective. Effectiveness comes from how you designed it. Did you pay attention to the cognitive load theory and aligning that and thinking about what your learner already knew? So that's very, very important. I know a lot of the times we may get stuck in, oh, I don't want to make it more than 5 minutes, but you could overwhelm, you could overload somebody's working memory if we were so thinking about from a timing perspective or time perspective and not from a mental complexity perspective. So that's an important thing to think about when you're designing micro learning or macro lessons. I think one more slide. There's 3 more principles that I want to talk about. You can go to the next, Chris. Then there's 3 more principles here. The next one talking about appropriate timing. And by timing, I don't mean time, not the time frame, but I'm saying when to introduce. So think about spaced practice, distributed practice. You want to organize it in a way. When was the training done and when would be a good time to do a recap? When would be a good time to do a retrieval? That's what you want to be thinking about when you're doing micro learning, right? Remember, you're tapping into a really powerful tool and aligning it with folks' busy lifestyles. But you want it to be effective. It shouldn't just be like kind of lip service. We did micro learning, it would have worked. No, you have to do a little bit more deeper thinking about it, right? So the timing is very important, and evidence shows that when you organize, when you distribute it a certain way, you're really, really setting yourself and your training and the trainee to a level of success, right? Think also about format. This is where you want to really take a deep dive into dual coding theory and which multimedia principles will be applicable. If you're using a video, do you want a talking head? Do you not want a talking head? Do you want to use an AI avatar? What kind of expressions that should have? There's science around it, there's studies around it, and you can really use that. Sometimes could just an audio do the trick, or do I want visuals? If it's a process I'm explaining, then maybe I need to see what's happening, and maybe my talking head could go away because I could be the distraction, because I want the person to focus on the process and my voice could do the job, because that's what dual coding theory tells us, right? So think about the format. It's not one format will always work. Video works sometimes, text works other times, text and visuals work another time. Sometimes just the voice does the trick. So you have to think about that format, and it's really important. And again, connected back to, is it going to overload the working memory, or is it going to actually make room for it, right? That could always be your track to stay on, right, as you design instruction. And last but not the least, appropriate interactivity. Now, interactivity here does not mean social interaction. It primarily means How are you going to get the learner to engage with the content? Think retrieval practice. What kind of questions am I going to ask? What kind of reflection am I going to give them so they actually can apply this in their job to be able to, work more effectively, efficiently, and things like that. I think I have one more slide, Chris. It's probably just, if you're hungry for more micro learning, then I have a blog called Science of Learning. Here's a QR code. If you're on your, I'll share the link in the chat as well in a second. But this is a blog that I co-write with a professor and a colleague and a dear friend of mine, Jim Hewitt. And we write this together, and we share snippets from the Science of Learning for people who may not have time to read a huge meta-analysis, but we do that, and we filter that information and share it with folks. And that's it.
Awesome. No, Nidhi, thank you. No, thank you so much. And everybody watching, please, if you could, give a round of emojis for that. It was absolutely fantastic, Nidhi, as I knew it would be. And you know what? We made it work with the PDF just fine. So look at that. No problem. We worked around the technical difficulties. And the one question, because we're running short on time, but the one question that I had for you is, there's a lot of stuff here. When you think about some of the things you see, what is a cardinal sin that you often go, this is something I commonly see happen when people are doing microlearning or trying to do this, that's a really easy, maybe overdone mistake?
Trying to fit too much because they think so much about the time frame. If you look at any definition of microlearning, Chris, there's always like, it's short and sweet and it's this many seconds. And when we allow that pressure to come on us, then we try to fit too much in that small span of time, and that's where you make errors. And you could fit it, but I always say, I can cognitively overload you in 30 seconds as well, but I can also really make you understand something if I were to break it down a little bit more. So that's a big piece I see. And I guess the other extreme version of it could be making too much into it, right? Or just breaking it into pieces and thinking this is microlearning. No, it's a lot more than that. There's a lot more science to it, and Science of Learning should always be the cue, I would say, to design that. Yeah.
I love that. And I think that happens so often where we go, well, this is also something really good to tell people too, instead of going, but it's not relevant now, take it out, give people only the minimum of what they need. So I love that. And I also love your point about being really intentional about everything that you're doing.